So yeah, thank you very much. In the first Ayahuasca conference in Ibiza, there was one of the closing keynotes was an anthropologist, and she said something that really made me think. She said that she thought that the biggest challenge that was facing the Ayahuasca scene or community as large was how they dealt or how they handled diversity. There's two aspects to this. You know, one aspect is I think a lot of what we've been seeing today, the inclusion of people of color, different genders, etc., into what it is admittedly a mostly white male scene. And then there's another aspect with it that has to do with how certain voices come or do not come into the picture and into the discussions that are being had. And this is a little bit what this talk is about. My name is Geronimo. I work for the ICS Foundation. I encourage you, if you don't know about our work, I encourage you to look at our website. ICS is an NGO that specializes, focuses on plant medicines. We'll call it botanicals, plants with a history of traditional use. And I have to admit, like most everything in the psychedelic scene, it's mostly white guys, such as myself. With that said, there's a lot of diversity of backgrounds. There's scientists, there's policy experts, there's ayahuasca devotees like myself. There's all sorts of things, and you know, because we're an NGO, we're not a cult. We don't have really a very solid party line about what we think. There's a diversity of opinions as well, and approaches to these things. I guess I could say that if we agree on something, there's a sort of base agreement. One is, of course, that there's great promise and potential, and we believe there's great promise and potential for the use of these plants. And the other thing that I think we all agree on could go something like this. In terms of we believe in personal freedom but collective responsibility, or personal freedom but responsibility to the collective. That is to say, we all believe that you should be free to do what you want to do with yourself. There's a great Spanish philosopher, Antonio Escotado. He put it very beautifully. He's written a lot about drugs, and he says, "My skin is a frontier, is a border, and from the skin in, it's a sovereign country. And no other, government, state, whatever, has the right to tell me what to do, what happens, on the other side of my skin." So we do agree, basically we do agree with this. At the same time, the freedom to do what you want to do ends where other people's skins begin, and this is something that we all sort of agree on. So while we think that people should be free to do what we want to do and try and experiment, etc., the minute that one person takes the responsibility to serve, whether it's a cup of ayahuasca or give an entheogen of any type to another person, we believe that that person enters into a different stage of responsibility, and you're no longer exactly free to do what we want to do what you want to do. You have a responsibility over the people that you're giving this substance to. The same way that a young college student has, in that sense, more freedom than an older man who runs a company and who has 4 children. Because they're responsible for more things, then they have less freedom about it. Now you will see how this ties up with the main topic of the talk, which actually has to do with a very long, very ongoing discussion or argument that happens within the ayahuasca community, which is this sort of endless struggle or chain of disagreements between what you would call on one side, making very big generalizations, the traditionalists, so people who believe that we should stick to the tradition and do things exactly as we were told, and what you would call the innovators, which are people who think that they have a right to change things and improvise and evolve the ways that things are working. Again, this has everything to do with giving it to other people. This is where it gets tricky. This is why it's no longer an issue of personal freedom, because when people want to innovate, they're not talking about how they innovate with themselves, but they're talking about they're innovating in a sort of number of practices that actually involve other people, and the same with the tradition. So if you are not familiar with these arguments, and you're drinking ayahuasca, you're either drinking ayahuasca by yourself or you're drinking with a group that it really doesn't talk to anybody, because I mean, I can assure you the 15 years drinking ayahuasca, these sort of arguments, they're endless. They go on forever. As a matter of fact, in the next ayahuasca conference that happened in Rio Branco, they sort of exploded in a very public manner in a number of the debates and the public talks. There was one in particular where I don't actually remember what the issue was. I think it's a very old issue among the ayahuasca religions in Brazil that has to do with the inclusion or not of cannabis by some lines. And then some other lines, more traditional lines, totally reject this new practice. And this sort of exploded into a quite open discussion. And at one point, Edward McRae, who's an anthropologist and a long-time researcher of these things, basically made the following distinction, which was between tradition and religion. He said, tradition is something that people believe that comes from a line and that it's never changed. But in fact, oral traditions, they change all the time. So you find that, a certain indigenous group will have, for example, a creation myth. And this doesn't include white people because they're pre-contact. And then the minute they're contacted, very soon afterwards, the creation myths change. And they include now white people. So in a strange sense, oral cultures are always updated. They're always talking about the present, even though they're talking about the past. He said, and that's tradition. Tradition is the belief that something doesn't change, or oral traditions, but in fact they change all the time and they're constantly updated. On the other hand, religions, they tend towards immobilism. They don't change easily. There's a lot of resistance in religions to change for a number of reasons, for respect to the founders, for a number of well-justified reasons. But what defines religion, it's its resistance to change. It doesn't mean religions doesn't change either, but they change with more of a struggle. And this is what he presented to this community of people from the Brazilian religions who were having this argument. To this, which he said, the woman who was from the Marquinha replied, okay, we understand this. We understand that, things are in movement and cultures change and things evolve and people should have a right to try new things, and perhaps it's true that they have a right to try new things. What we are arguing is that we have the right not to change things. And that's a decision that we have made. We are sticking to what our master said, and we're doing exactly like the master said. And we're not adding new things, and we're certainly not going to do things that the master explicitly says shouldn't be done, which is, we believe, what these people are doing. So the argument wasn't about whether some things were left open and they had been changed. The argument was about things that the original founder had said shouldn't be done were now being done. Right? So that's sort of the argument. And this argument happens not only within the religions, but it happens also, with indigenous groups, the indigenous, the shamans. I mean, it's an endless thing in the ayahuasca world. So later on, in a news group, in a mailing list in which I participated, a number of ayahuasca people, there was another huge debate broke out, and it was over basically this. It was presented as this. It was presented as tradition. People who were like sticking to the tradition versus innovation, and this was, again, a huge polemic. Now, what I want to stress is that the polemic is never tradition versus innovation in the abstract sense. The debate is always certain traditions and whether or not they're kept, very concrete ones, and certain innovations and whether or not they are incorporated. So necessarily for this talk, I'm going to be making generalizations. I'm going to be talking in abstract ways about things that are in fact very concrete and very landed. I'm not here to present any solutions on this. I don't think there are solutions on this. What I want to share with you is a number of perspectives, a number of places where you can look at these things that have been very useful for me in my work. So, many years ago, I went and stayed in someone's house, and in the bedroom they had something like this. This is for those of you that don't recognize it. This is a piece of church furniture of Catholicism. You have this in chapels and in churches, and this is where you kneel before you're giving the host. it was really surprising for me to see that in a living room, not a living room, in a bedroom, completely decontextualized of the place where I was used to see it. I want to stress this is not a sacred object of Catholicism. It really is just a church furniture. But it was still, for me, just kind of strange and unsettling. I felt, I would have never put that object in my living room, right? And I live in Ibiza, and Ibiza is a place where Buddha statues are, as a matter of practice, placed just about everywhere. In gardens, in restaurants, in clubs, in bars, in hotels, everywhere. I googled Buddha restaurant, and I found this picture. This is a hotel in Budapest, the Buddha Hotel, and it's got a giant Buddha statue placed there. Now, I heard somebody tell me that Buddha statues are the new garden dwarfs of the middle class. And it could be. One thing that I do, very often to help me think about these types of things have to do with, cultural appropriation, different cultures, etc. Because it is so difficult to think about these things, because many times we're dealing with things that are very remote to us. It's you take the same situation, but you change it to something closer so you can understand what is happening. So let's imagine, instead of this, let's imagine the Jesus Hotel. And what would happen if clubs had Jesus statues and Virgin statues, and they'd be like Jesus in gardens, and people would open restaurants and put like big Jesus and giant Jesus, and Jesus everywhere, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong, just like there's nothing wrong with this, but there's something, then you begin to see how it's actually what it is. It's a bit weird, is what it is. Nothing, the feeling that you feel when you think about it, it's just, that's kind of strange, Here's another example. You might be familiar with this. This is a Native American headdress, a war bonnet. And as you know, recently it has become cool in certain festivals, Coachella and whatnot, to wear these things. And then there's been a huge backlash from the Native American community saying that this is cultural appropriation, that it's really disrespectful, that people have no right to wear those feathers, that these feathers are loaded with meaning, blah, blah. And then there's been a next backlash from that community saying, what the hell, this is just costumes, people dressed as astronauts, people dressed as firemen, and people dressed as Indians, why couldn't do this if we're going to follow this logic? Then indigenous people couldn't dress up as astronauts or as priests or as military generals because that's not part of their culture. That's sort of where the argument stands. Now, I'm going to stretch a little bit more just so you get sort of, what I want to present here is not take sides but present the entire panorama of the arguments. To this argument, the indigenous activists answer that this is not an issue of two equal sides deciding who wears what of which, because the white culture is so much more powerful and the indigenous culture is a minority culture. This cannot be thought about unless you look at the whole context. And suddenly, when you realize that these people are standing in the United States, which used to be a native territory until it was taken over by white people, and that this is something that is ongoing, that white people have gone to the Americas and they have taken the land and they have taken the resources and they have taken everything that used to belong to native people, and some Native American philosophers and activists are arguing the next step of that is taking the culture. Now we're taking the culture. We're taking the shamanism, we're taking the spirituality, and we're also appropriating these sort of things, and that's why they argue it's not okay for white people to dress up like this. Again, I think it's useful when one tries to think about these things to move it to something that is more familiar, so you can really understand what is happening. So let's remove the war bonnet, and let's think, for example, of the Jewish skull caps, the kippas, which we're all familiar with. Now imagine it became hip among hipsters, to wear, to go to the club wearing one of these, Jewish skull caps. And again, okay, you're not Jewish, and this thing doesn't, I guess it's just a hat. It doesn't actually mean anything. But it's, but you see what it is. No, there's something weird there. You can feel it, right? That would be a little bit weird, right? So it's like, it's these types of thought experiments, I think, that are very important to do when you're trying to think about these things, because otherwise it's very difficult to understand, what is being said, from both sides, And, we're all, this is all, we're all part of this, I'm wearing this shirt that says Sufi, as you know, the Sufis are, very important group of Islamic mystics, but this shirt actually has nothing to do with it. It's the name of a synthesizer plugin, right? But I like this shirt, right? So here I am wearing, and I think this is like really, sadly, the ultimate freedom that we don't want to give up, is the freedom to be hip, whichever way we want, including these things. I think this is, so then perhaps, this is not about tradition and innovation, and this is not, but perhaps it has to do more with like freedom and respect. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that, that yes, that you're free to do what you want to do, and that your freedom lasts until you get to somebody else's skin, and there it ends. But actually, seemingly, it's not. It actually stops before the skin. Maybe it stops in something that has to do with more like the culture or things that they hold important, and suddenly your freedom cannot quite go there the same way. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Scottish people should have more to say about quilts than the Korean people. And perhaps, just perhaps, Buddhists, real Buddhists, should have more to say about Buddha statues than everybody else. It seems that perhaps, Buddhists should have more to say about Buddha statues that, I'm making this up, but probably well-meaning but misguided interior decorators from Budapest, who actually built that hotel, right? Now, more than 10 years ago, when I was still stupid enough to get into long internet debates with people, don't do it, it's a waste of time, it goes nowhere, very frustrating, avoid the forums, doesn't work. But anyway, when I was still doing this stupidity, I got in a huge argument, there was a number of us, over this thing. It was more than 10 years ago, and basically the argument rotated around the following. It was whether or not it was okay for people to go to Peru, Iquitos, etc., spend 2 months, 3 months, 7 months, whatever, learning from an indigenous shaman, and then go back to their country where nobody could tell the difference between a proper shamanic ceremony and a pantomime, and proceeded to, put down the dresses, sing the songs, and sing the maraca. This is sort of the argument. It was going back and forth about this. Just how much would you have to learn? Can white people learn this stuff anyway? They can, they cannot, blah, blah, back and forth. And there was a point when somebody, posted, very, very innocent, I think it's very interesting, and he said, I don't get why everybody's arguing. What is the worst that can happen? What is the worst that can happen if you go and you only learn for 3 months, and then you put on some feathers and some things, and then you sing these songs to some other white people? Really, what is the damage? What is the worst that can happen? And, that made me think that perhaps, the argument wasn't about any of these things. The argument wasn't about tradition versus innovation, or about, about religion versus tradition, of all of these things. But perhaps the argument is about important versus unimportant. That is, if you think that the songs that the Shipibo shaman songs are very important, and the order in which they're sung, they're very important, and the place from where they come is very important, and the way that the ayahuasca is cooked, and all of these things is very important, then it is very important that you're doing that stuff right or wrong. However, if you don't think it's very important, then, of course, it doesn't seem very important whether you sing the songs right or wrong. If you don't think it's very important, then all of these things can become, in a way, fashion accessories. The same way that many people wear, Tibetan prayer beads as a fashion accessory. Or that somebody can put this piece of, church furniture in their living room, or that somebody can wear a war bonnet or a Buddha statue in a restaurant. This all happens. The message that is behind this is not whether this is right or wrong or innovation. It's like, is this important or is this not important? Because if it's not important, then all of this is okay. It's okay. And if it's important, then suddenly none of this is okay. And I think really this is the crux of the debate, and this is the reason why these debates go on forever, and this is the reason why they never get solved. Because nobody can convince somebody else that what they think is important, and vice versa. This is not a logical argument about whether this can be done or not. It's an argument about what is the value of this. This is what's underneath all of that. And that's an argument that just everybody stands in one place with respect to all of these things, and somebody else stands somewhere else. So, given how difficult this all is, and it is very difficult, like I said, I've been arguing and talking and thinking about this for many, many years, what I would like to provide now are some points of perspective as opposed to points of view. So what these are places from which to stand, that I found useful when you try to, for myself, when I try to look and understand these very complex issues, that have to do with all of these things and these arguments between all these things, The first one, it's from humility, and I'm not talking about the spiritual virtue of humility. I'm talking about the acknowledgement of ignorance. It's very down to earth humility. It's humility and being like, okay, how much do you really know? I mean, let's be honest. Do I really know? How much do I really know about Buddhism? If you ask me this, I would say, I know quite a bit about Buddhism. I was actually for a while a comparative religions student. I took classes on Buddhism. I read the classic books. I read Suzuki. I read that stuff. I think I know some stuff about Buddhism. But the truth is, if I actually had to sit down with a piece of paper and write about Buddhism, what I know, you would end up with something that would perhaps be equivalent of the first 2 paragraphs of the Wikipedia entrance. Really, really shallow, sort of rounded stuff. Humility is, really being able to be humble about, your own huge ignorance. And this is especially salient when you're dealing with other cultures, with shamanic, exotic practices, with what happens in other places, etc. I think that's one thing, and again, as you understand, I'm talking from the point of view of someone who receives the brew and speaking towards the person who serves it. I think when that is the person who's actually experimented with different ways of doing things or innovating or whatever, that person has a responsibility towards humility in terms of what is actually the breadth of their knowledge. Because depending on how much you know, certain things might look totally okay or not. Feeding of that, and following is, the perspective of being serious about getting schooled. If you admit that you really don't know that much about this stuff, and that it's hard to know about this stuff, well, the next thing you have to do is, you have to be actually rather serious about learning. And this includes not just reading the psychedelic books about the tiny psychedelic scene that we are, but a much broader perspective, especially if you're studying the traditional ways, whether it's the Ayahuasca religions or the shamanic practices in South America. This is like, you cannot understand this stuff, I'm telling you from the heart, if you just read the psychedelic books about this stuff, because they're thoroughly incomplete. You cannot, if you don't get a much wider perspective that includes the history of the broader place, the rest of the economy, the rest of how things are working, much larger historical forces, you'll never understand, exactly what was that gave shape and form to that shamanic part of the information that you're interested in. That's one thing. The other thing, it's, again, if you were to be a representative of an expert on ancient Greeks, and you were not able to read and write ancient Greek, nobody would take you very seriously. As a researcher, simply because you'll be dealing with second-hand information. If you cannot read the sources, then what kind of researcher on Greek anything are you? You can't read the stones directly. You don't know what they say. You're dealing everything with second-hand. I mean, this is a basic setup in people who professionally learn about things. You really have to get there. I mean, you can't be a teacher of French literature if you don't speak French, or you're not going to be quite as good, because you can't read the original. I personally have always big problems with a number of people that I met that practice Amazonian or South American shamanism, who told me that they have learned from indigenous teachers and indigenous healers, and they don't speak Spanish. I mean, I'm not even talking about the native language, just Spanish, the halfway through language. It's like, how can you really have one? I mean, how deep can your training be if you weren't even able to directly communicate with your teacher? And then people tell me, no, my teacher was teaching me telepathically. No, really, he was even teaching me at a distance. When I was back in, I was still receiving, you know, and what can I say? It's like, well, you know, how wonderful, how convenient. You know, I'm not, you know, I don't want to doubt, you know, but I think, you know, honestly, I mean, for myself, you know, I found that this is it's a good place to stand from which to approach these things. The other thing has to do with this. And again, the personal freedom it's very important here, comes into the picture. Now, because we live in a world where, you know, an evil state has told us that we can't take certain things and we can't do certain things, we all tend to be anti-authoritarian, you know, and we claim our freedom, and that's, you know, and that's of course very good. And while all of us agree that absolute authority is a terrible thing and it's a bad thing, you know, I want to, at the very least, you know, sort of, you know, raise a hand for relative authority. Because I don't think all things are the same. You know, I was last weekend, I was at a presentation by Mestre Felipe of the UDB. And this guy has been drinking ayahuasca for 42 years. I'm going to say that again, 42 years drinking ayahuasca. And he's gone through the legalization process of ayahuasca in Brazil and now in Europe and a number of times. Okay, that is authority. Now, you can put it wherever you want, you know, but you have to understand that the opinions of a 5-year-old, although valuable, are not the same as the opinions of a 20-year-old or a 40-year-old. And this is what I mean by reframing authority. Now, from which place and how do you deal with the different levels of authority of the people that you're going to encounter as you're trying to learn about these things? Because very often, you know, this thing turns into some sort of like rebellious thing about my personal freedom to, you know, and of course, again, you are absolutely personal free to go any way you want, and I believe this wholeheartedly. But if you're going to give something to somebody else, then you're not as free. You're not as free, and that's what this fits in. Indeed, this I think is the final thing that I would say. When many years ago I was in Peru, and people knew that I was interested in these things. And a friend of mine came to me and he said, you know, you should really meet this guy. He's really interesting. He's this Peruvian guy, and he's been working with curanderos for more than 20 years. And he's a teacher of traditional medicine at the local university. And I think the two of you will get along. You should really meet. He's a very interesting guy. And I said, of course, you know, I'd love to meet this person. So a meeting was arranged, and, you know, and we got talking. And he began to tell me about this plan that he had to start sort of a traditional medicine center where tourists could come. And then he showed me the planned program that he had drafted for these hypothetical tourists. It was a 12-day program, you know, and it included all the traditional plants that I knew, except it included all of them in a row in what was honestly, you know, quite brutal schedule, you know, nothing like indigenous people take. You know, he was giving 3 types of sanango one day after the other. He was doing a number of things that I was just like, holy shit, you know, I'm not signing up for this, you know. And I really hope that you do this yourself before you give this to tourists. And he replied, we have to innovate, right? To which my reply was, you know, I've always read traditional systems of medicine as sort of a collective build-up of knowledge that comes from many years of trial and error, and that's how it builds up. Now, of course, they're not perfect, and of course you can innovate and discover new things. It is very possible that we haven't found the best way to cook ayahuasca yet, and somebody might discover better ways to cook ayahuasca. I'm not denying this at all. But again, let's put it in context. You look at how we drive. You know, it took many years to develop this system of like road signs and things and protocols, so all these cars could circulate on the roads and not crash into each other. Now, in the name of personal freedom, somebody would say, I think there might be a better way to drive, and I'm going to try that. And I commend this person on this. You know, I think it's good because it might be true. It might be very true that there's better ways to do it that we haven't even imagined because we're stuck on this system. It might be true. I also think that this person, on the way of learning, because it's trial and error, is going to make a lot of mistakes. And I don't know what he's going to do. He's going to back the car into something. He's going to drive off into, you know, go figure. So while I encourage this person to do it, I don't want to be next to this person while he's learning and making mistakes. See, this is what I mean about experiments you begin to oneself. If you're going to innovate, that's very fine. But don't innovate with other people, you know, because your freedom ends, you know, where my skin begins. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.